we start with the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which was a war between Great Britain and France with her Indian allies. In North America, the fighting was over the control of the Ohio River Valley, and which power would have control over what is the eastern half of North America. The British won this war of rising global powers, but they went into great debt to do so. For our North American British colonies, this will lead to a loss of salutary neglect, as the British will become more hands-on with governing and regulating their colonies in order to avoid war with Native Americans and extract resources and taxes. Loyalists are American colonists who are against antagonizing the British with protest and violence. They will go on to support the British in the Revolutionary War, and while given equal rights in the Treaty of Paris, many will still go back to England. A major Loyalist figure is Thomas Hutchinson. On the other end were patriots. Most of them believed the British have unlawfully restricted natural rights and were against the British in the Revolution. There are many major figures, but some of the most prominent were Washington, Paine, Revere, Adams, Henry, and Franklin. Thomas Paine's common sense, influenced by many other revolutionary ideas in literature like Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. In Common Sense, Paine calls for independence and a republican government. He says it is absurd for an island to rule a continent and criticizes the traditional tyrannical monarchy. His pamphlet is widely read around the colonies and written in easy-to-read and understand vernacular. The first battles of the Revolutionary War actually take place in Concord and Lexington a year before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. A British detachment based in the hotspot of revolutionary fervor, Massachusetts, went into the colony to disarm militias. Instead, the militias fought the British. A year later, the colonies formally declared independence. The war itself has many twists and turns, which we're not going to cover here. It ultimately ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the formation of the United States. The war is a part or result of the overall American Revolution. So let's take a quick look at this. Some will say, notably John Adams, the revolution occurred before the war. He meant that the revolution was the ideas of natural rights and the American colonists identifying themselves less as British subjects and more as free Americans. The Declaration of Independence and war were a result or effect of those ideas. Others say the revolution occurs after the war when the ideas are put into practice, and we can see that with the democratic forms of government in the failed Articles of Confederation and a successful Constitution with its Bill of Rights. And still others say it is ongoing, that the U.S. has struggled to live up to its ideals laid in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. There has been continuous revolution through its history, as seen in the ending of slavery, expanding women's rights and roles, and ending segregation. The Declaration of Independence does more than break away the colonies from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson, the author, discusses inherent inalienable rights that are not dependent on government, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and also declaring that all men are created equal. This has a strong philosophical basis in the writings of John Locke and the Enlightenment. Okay, next we have the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government. It will be short-lived, though, as it fails due to its lack of an effective centralized government. Some of the issues are there was no power to raise an army, impose taxes, or regulate commerce. It does have one success, though, and that is the Northwest Ordinance, which organizes the Northwest territories gained in the Treaty of Paris. The ordinance outlines requirements for statehood and also bans slavery in the Northwest territories. With the government under the Articles of Confederation not working well, leaders from across the states gathered to draft a new government under a constitution. At the drafting of this government, many issues were debated, including how the legislative branch should be organized, the relation of the national government to state governments, slavery, and the power of the executive branch. After the draft was complete, it was sent to the states for ratification. Now, let's talk about those who supported the Constitution and those who did not. The Federalists were the group that favored the Constitution and a strong central government. They wanted to limit state power and said the Senate would still support state interests. While not directly opposing the Bill of Rights, they also did not feel one was necessary. They definitely wanted to get rid of the weak Articles of Confederation, and their base of support was mostly large-scale farmers, merchants, and artisans. In general, they were also pro-British style of government, with a hierarchical structure and somewhat of a distrust of the people. On the other side were the Anti-federalists, who opposed the Constitution and a strong central government. They supported state power and rights. Also, they said if a Constitution must be passed, at the very least, it must include a Bill of Rights. They were more open to amending the Articles than creating and passing the Constitution. In general, they want a smaller republic, or as Jefferson would call it, a yeoman farmer republic, of which their base of support was small rural farmers. Later, many of the Anti-federalists would also be supportive of the French Revolution. So in general, both these groups agree upon having an independent country and a republic. However, they disagree on what direction America should take and the strength and power of the national government. This will lead to nasty divisions later on and ongoing debates throughout all of U.S. history about the size and role of U.S. government. Both of these groups are not political parties. However, they plant the seeds of the first two-party system of the Hamiltonian Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Moving on to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution shortly after its adoption. They are heavily supported by Anti-federalists. The amendments themselves have many legal protections and civil rights. While the U.S. may have been a republic, it was not very democratic. Voting was limited to only white males with property. Property qualifications will be done away with in the 1800s, but it will be a long, slow process until the right to vote is expanded to all. The French Revolution is a major upheaval within France that will impact all of Europe and much of the world, including the United States. The revolution starts out with similar ideas to the American Revolution of doing away with monarchy and elite privileges and guaranteeing rights for all. However, it takes a turn towards violence, executions, and an overall reign of terror. Within the US, there is a heavy and divisive debate about where the US should stand. Some felt strongly pro-French, as they identified with both the ideals of the French Revolution and the US owed the French for support, as they supported the US Revolution. Others, notably Hamilton, will be anti-French and regard the revolution and terror as the exact thing the US was trying to prevent with a stronger federal government. The Hamiltonians will regard the British model as more stable. The now President Washington will try to take a middle approach and declare neutrality, and the US would only act to protect its economic interests. Washington's famous farewell address, a staple of many AP US history tests. Washington decides to not seek a third term as president, thereby setting an important precedent. Before he leaves, though, he gives an increasingly divided country words of wisdom in his farewell address, of which all of it will not be followed at some point. He says to stay out of European conflicts, which America will do until the 20th century. Washington warns against forming political parties because that will lead to more division. However, that happens immediately after Washington is gone. Finally, and this goes along with the political parties warning, is to not become divided by regional interests. And we know this will be a major hallmark of the 1800s, with divisions over tariffs and especially slavery. So great advice, but not followed. Speaking of political parties, let's take a look at the first two. Starting with the Hamiltonian Federalists, they favor a strong federal government, a national bank, tariffs to support a manufacturing economy, and good relations with Great Britain, not Green Bay, which does not exist yet. And I don't think Hamilton would have been a Packers fan. Seems more like a Giants fan. I think Jefferson would have more appreciated the Packers. Small town team owned by a group of regular shareholders. Anyways, the Jeffersonian Democrats were founded by their namesake, Jefferson, and buddy James Madison. In general, there is a clear link to the Anti-federalists here. They favor states' rights, less federal government, oppose the national bank, and are pro-French. There is kind of a key switch here, though, and that is Madison, who authored the Constitution, now joining the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Okay, let's run a few pieces of key info from the 1790s. Try to view these through the lens of the Federalists and Republicans. A lot of College Board questions like to ask how those two camps view these events. So the first one we're going to cover is Jay's Treaty, and how that attempts to resolve lingering issues with the British, including removing the British from the Northwest Territories, ending the impressment of American sailors, and working out some debt issues. The Federalists cheered the treaty, while the Republicans, especially Secretary of State Jefferson, were very critical of it. I want to briefly run through some key events from Adams' tumultuous one-term presidency. First, the XYZ affair, which was a foreign relations debacle. It was made public that American diplomats were to pay a French official a bribe for international relations. Coming after the uproar of the XYZ affair, a quasi or undeclared war with France occurred. This was a result of poor relations between the US and France. The war itself was a short-lived naval war with France. But again, circling back to the Federalists and Republicans, those in the Republican camp were aghast that the Adams administration led America into a conflict with France, who Republicans felt we should be allies with. Then came the Alien Act, which was aimed at restricting activities for non-citizens, specifically French revolutionaries who were stirring up trouble in the US. The act allowed the government to expel foreigners easily and change requirements for citizenship to 14 years residing in the US from 5 years. Finally was the highly controversial Sedition Act, a new law that outlawed any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the President, and made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Federalists agree with most of these measures, while Jeffersonian Republicans vehemently disagree with all of these measures. So now let's look at the Republican response to all of those acts that they did not like, which was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions stated that states had the right to nullify federal laws they deem unconstitutional. This idea of nullification will live a long life and come up again in the 1800s with tariffs and slavery. The Hamiltonians and others would point to the supremacy clause in the Constitution, thus leaving the resolutions null and void. Okay, last term, and a topic we have not spent enough time on, and that is women's roles. So European and colonial society were very patriarchal, and the US will very much stay a patriarchy, with women having their subordinate sphere and be relegated to the cult of domesticity. However, an idea of Republican motherhood springs up, which somewhat elevates the social status of women. It is the idea that now that the United States is its own country, and it's a republic, with its citizens playing a vital role, women need to teach children, especially their sons, to be good Republican citizens, to be engaged in a new democratic society, in which they have many freedoms and decisions they can make. Aside from the importance of education, it generally does not shift the American mindset of gender equality, in which society was highly unequal for women, who are not afforded many of the rights in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Okay, that does it for Period 3 terms. Subscribe to the channel for more AP US History Simplified videos. First, we're going to start off with participatory democracy. With the passage of the Constitution, which only had one half of one branch that was popularly elected, and also many state laws even further restricted voting to only white males with property. Period 4 saw those property requirements slowly done away with, expanding suffrage to all white males. Aside from voting, various reform movements during Period 4 that we will discuss later on also show an active citizenry. Finally, a part of Period 4 is also described as the era of the common man due to these democratic developments. We are going to quickly cover two important Supreme Court cases. The first is Marbury v. Madison. This case stemmed from some last-minute or midnight appointments of judges by John Adams before he left office. Those appointments were challenged. The mostly Federalist Supreme Court threw out those appointments, but the key takeaway is that the Supreme Court in its ruling defines its jurisdiction through judicial review, which is its ability to declare executive and congressional acts unconstitutional if they deem them to be, thereby making the acts null and void. The second Supreme Court case that we're going to cover is Maryland v. McCulloch. This case, along with a few other cases in the era, strengthened and affirmed the power of the national government over state governments. In this specific instance, the state of Maryland tried to tax a national bank branch in its state. The Supreme Court said they could not do that, and Congress had the implied powers through the Necessary and Proper Clause to charter a national bank. It was a big win for those that had the viewpoints of the Federalists of the 1790s that wanted a strong centralized government, supreme over the state governments. The Second Great Awakening occurs from the late 1700s to the early 1800s. It is a religious revival movement, of which many became concerned with preparing for the second coming of Christ. There are ideas about human perfectibility in utopian societies within the Second Great Awakening. It is also influenced by the Revolution. We also see women taking leadership roles within the movement, in some cases like that of Anne Lee and the Shakers, even being thought of as Christ-like figures themselves. The influence of the Second Great Awakening will be a cause of some of the reform movements we see in Period 4, including the prison reform movement, focusing on rehabilitation instead of punishment, expansion of public education, the temperance movement, and the abolitionist movement. Shifting now to politics, early in the time period, the Federalist Party lost power and influence and eventually would dissolve. This left the Democratic-Republican Party as the sole major party of the country. After his victory in 1800, Jefferson reversed the course of the Federalists and decreased the size of the federal government, and emphasized his yeoman-farmer republic ideal. A couple of presidents later, and after the War of 1812, President Monroe presided over a short period of time known as the Era of Good Feelings, where political division in America was low and feelings of nationalism were high. However, factions would develop within the Democratic Republicans over various issues, none more so than Clay's American system, with the specific aspects of the national bank and tariffs. In steps the very divisive character of Andrew Jackson. He would lead a faction known as the Jacksonian Democrats, who believed in the spread of political power to the people. They were focused on Western expansion even by aggressive means, and vehemently were against the national bank. Eventually, anti-Jackson politicians will form the Whig Party, which starts the second two-party system. Speaking of the Whigs, as mentioned before, they formed as an opposition party to the Jacksonian Democrats, led by the man behind the American system idea, Henry Clay. They are active from the late 1830s to the early 1850s. They supported tariffs, the national bank, and federal spending on internal improvements. Many were against the Mexican-American War in the 1840s and were more cautious with Manifest Destiny. Switching to economic developments and terms. Economically, Period 4 is defined by the market revolution. This is a physical and mindset change in how manual labor was conducted. Before, most industry and production was done in individual homes, farms, or on plantations. But because of inventions and innovations that increased in efficiency and lowered transportation costs, we started seeing the rise of impressive factory complexes. The market revolution will help link together regional markets around the U.S. The American system goes in hand with the market revolution. Supported by Henry Clay, a longtime influential politician from Kentucky, the system and Clay had the goal of connecting the country together economically and wanted to see the regions become reliant upon each other, which he felt would modernize the economy and lead to a more united country. Key to his ideas were increases in tariffs to protect American industry from foreign competition, fund internal improvements so the regions could efficiently transport goods to each other, and support a national bank to help fund a sound system of currency and help with major loans to projects. All of these things are controversial, though, and will cause rifts in the Democratic-Republican Party. On one end, the South, led by South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, will have a strong dislike of tariffs. Andrew Jackson, his faction, will strongly be anti-national bank. And in general, there are philosophical disagreements over the proper role of the national government in the economy. Getting to some specific market revolution developments, steamships will come onto the scene and make water transport much more efficient as they can sail upstream and against the wind far easier than sailboats. And major canal projects will take place, most notably the engineering marvel, the Erie Canal, which when completed will help link the West to coastal markets. A major process you need to know is these developments will drastically reduce travel and shipping times across the country. Another major development is interchangeable parts. While it may not sound like a big deal today, this innovation will be a big boost to the market revolution, as standardized parts for common items like farm equipment and guns are produced, which allows for easy fixes and replacements. It also increases economic efficiency. The farming industry will benefit greatly from the mechanical reaper and steel plow. These innovations will help increase crop yields and allow farmers to use land that may not have been possible without the implements. It will especially help farmers in the West that are dealing with soil that has a heavy concentration of clay. Now looking at the factory systems, the most notable example is the textile industry led by the Lowell mills. Machines like the spinning jennies and cotton looms that use power from local rivers will lead to a boom in the textile industry. It also leads to one of Clay's goals, which is that the North will start to rely on Southern cotton to fuel its textile industry. There are also some other key social aspects with this new factory system that you need to understand as well. Many of the workers were young women who actually lived on site in dorms. Women working outside the home was a fairly new development in the US, which led to new ideas about work and family life. However, the work the women did was long, hard, and the pay was low. But the Lowell girls, as they were referred to, did receive some extra opportunities with education and made social connections with each other. The other aspect of Clay's American system are tariffs. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods. It is meant to protect American industry from foreign competition by making foreign countries' products more expensive than similar American-made products. However, European countries responded with their own tariffs, usually aimed at their cheap imports from America, which were Southern cash crops. It is a hot debate throughout Period 4, and many tariffs are tried, changed, thrown out, and tried again. Calhoun, the Southern anti-tariff leader, brings up the idea of state nullification of tariffs, harkening back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This leads to a standoff with President Jackson. And not really a spoiler, but Jackson wins the standoff after he passes the Force Act through Congress and threatens military action on South Carolina. Continuing on with tariffs, Clay's idea was that the money from the government collected with them would be used to support internal improvements like canals and national roads. It was also a divisive topic because there was debate about the proper role of the federal government. The advocates for more state sovereignty and strict constructivists of the Constitution argued that it was an improper role for the federal government to take on. Some national roads will be built, but many of the internal improvements will fall to the state governments to fund. Now, let's touch upon a few other terms and topics for Period 4. First is the well-known Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the U.S. Napoleonic France was struggling with reestablishing its colonial presence in the Americas and having all sorts of trouble attempting to put down the Haitian Revolution, which, by the way, also sparked fears in southern plantation owners in the U.S. as that revolution was led by slaves. After some diplomacy with the Jefferson administration, France offered the U.S. an incredible deal of the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. There was some discussion of the constitutionality of the deal and what were the borders of the territory, but it was too good for Jefferson to pass up. Keep in mind that no one had actually consulted the people that lived on most of that land, which were various native tribes. After the purchase, Jefferson commissioned the famous Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the territory, make contact with native tribes, and find a passage to the Pacific Ocean. A major controversy in the era, and an event that foreshadowed future problems, was the Missouri Compromise. Missouri had reached the point of being able to apply for statehood. This sparked the first major debate about the balance of free and slave states. There was an attempt to put a hard limit on slavery with the Talmadge Amendment that stated Missouri would not be a slave state, and the children of any slaves that currently lived there would be free. However, that did not pass. In 1820, a compromise was struck in which Maine would enter the Union as a free state, and Missouri would be a slave state, with a line drawn from its southern border west to demarcate future areas of slave and free territories and states. Across the U.S., there was settlement and continued search for arable land, that is, land that you can farm. As new territories were bought or conquered, this land opened up for expansion of a new cash crop, cotton, which was made possible by an invention called the cotton gin. Before, cotton had been difficult to work with, as the seeds needed to be separated from the cotton boil by hand to make use of it. The gin mechanized the separation, so now there was a huge demand to pick the cotton. The area where cotton grows best is in the Deep South. With the acquisition of new lands, cotton plantations started springing up further and further west. Along with the plantations was an expansion of slavery and the slave trade, which also shows the free and forced migration of people across the South. Lastly is a term and topic that could be brought up in any time period, including today. For us in APUSH, it straddles between periods 4 and 5, and that is xenophobia or nativism. In the 1840s and 1850s, there was an increase in migration of Irish and Germans, especially in the North. Irish were escaping the potato famine, and other Europeans, especially Germans, saw political upheaval with revolutions occurring across the continent. They did not receive a warm welcome in the U.S. Many Americans were Protestants, with a general fear and dislike of Catholicism, which some of the Germans and most of the Irish were. There were long-held feelings of prejudice towards the Irish, stemming from earlier British feelings. A whole political party springs up in the 1850s to try and restrict immigration, called the American Party, or Know Nothings. They will see a small amount of political success. However, they, along with the rest of the country, will be swept up into the coming storm of the Civil War.